Welcome to the Dublin Bible Talks, midweek Bible talks for workers in Dublin. I'm Cameron Jones. Today we look at Mark's account of Jesus' trial and ask, has Jesus' death become normal to me? Have I come to assume it rather than believe it? Have I lost the horror and the wonder of the cross? And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. In a courtroom in 1945-46 in Europe at the Nuremberg trials, picture that courtroom, a man in trial for their life. He's a camp from the Belsen concentration camp. And he's asked how it came to be that he brutalised and murdered and planned what was happening and covered it up. It was normal. It had become normal. That's what he said. It was normal. Not just to take tens or hundreds or thousands, but tens of thousands of his fellow men and women, and exterminate them with gas. It had become normal. The Irish statesman Edmund Burke said, "Custom reconciles us to everything." And the risk for us is that custom can reconcile us to the things that God has done for us and what God has said. They can become normal. They can become less than extraordinary. They can become things that we just expect, things that we take for granted, things that we don't think about because we just assume them. So put aside for a moment all of your familiarity with the Bible, all your familiarity with the story of Jesus' trial and crucifixion, and listen again with fresh ears this incident that starts in Mark chapter 15, verse 1. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things, so again Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of." But Jesus made no reply. And Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man named Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to get Pilate to release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Does that reading we heard just then make your blood boil? If you are not shocked by that, you either haven't understood it, or, worse still, justice and fairness have come to mean nothing to you. I mean, look at the facts. A convicted criminal who was properly and rightly sentenced is allowed to go free, and an innocent man, known to be innocent by the judicial authority, and the innocent one is condemned to execution. He is beaten and he is flogged and he is shamed and he is nailed to a cross. the convict and the innocent are in the wrong place in this story. They've been swapped. That's not just. That is not fair. Yet, here it is written in the Word of God. And as we look at this story with what I hope is fresh eyes, attempting to put aside our familiarity, what does it tell us? What does this mean? Was Jesus' death just a terrible mistake in history? An indication of the pointlessness of our lives, that virtue and goodness and love just get trampled on? Is that what this is saying? Or is it showing us the complete corruption of human rulers? All they are really doing is just clinging on to power for themselves. That the only difference between the properly appointed authority and the gangster is table manners and a refined accent. Is that the message of this passage? In fact, it's something far worse, and yet also far better. So let's look again at this account of the trial of Jesus and the man Barabbas. That's the first guy, Barabbas, the rebel who goes free. And then we have the rightful king, Jesus, who dies. And then we see the replacement, the replacement of Barabbas by Jesus on the cross. That's where we're going in this passage. So first, Barabbas, what are we told about him? Look at verse 7 of Mark 15. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. Mark links him with the rebels who had murdered in an insurrection. In Luke's account of this, we're told that murder and insurrection is why he was in prison. John, in his account, he writes a bit more pithily and describes him as a lestes, a terrorist. It's the same word that Mark uses in verse 27 to describe the two men who were crucified either side of Jesus. Now, we are not told who the victims of this terrorist act was, but to some extent that holds very little meaning to terrorists, doesn't it? When I was in Northern Ireland, I was working with people who knew terrorism far better than I do. In fact, I never met a person my age who had not had a friend or family member killed in the Troubles by terrorists. Now, I don't know your backgrounds in detail. I know some of you. But maybe you know people who have been personally impacted by such things as terrorism. Now, just consider if that kind of thing had happened to your friends or your family, how would you feel about the people who did things like that? Do you not despise them? Do you not feel contempt for them? Actually, I think it's right to feel that way, isn't it? About people who do such awful things? This man Barabbas, he deserved judicial punishment, didn't he? I mean, if anyone should have been executed on that day, it should have been the murderer, the killer, the terrorist Barabbas. What we see there is a genuine criminal, and he's getting away with it. And he's such a contrast to the second character in this account, Jesus. The whole passage underlines again and again that Jesus is the king. Look at verse 2. Are you the king of the Jews, is what Pilate asks. You see it again in verse 9 and verse 12, and then in verses 16 to 18, he's mockingly dressed as a king. He's saluted as if he was a king. In verse 26, the king of the Jews is what is written on the charge sheet that is nailed on the cross. That in verse 32, the priests and the scribes are calling him king, even though they're using ironic mocking of him. The passage comes back to King Jesus time and time again. Of course, Pilate and the soldiers and the priests, they're all saying it ironically, but they're telling the truth even though they don't recognise it. Jesus truly is, however, the rightful king. He is the descendant of David. He is from the family that God had appointed to rule over Israel, to be the sovereign over the Jewish people. The priests and the scribes, therefore, should have obeyed Jesus. They should have listened to him, not sought ways to kill him. This son of David has the rightful claim to be their king. So we're hearing of a group of high-ranking officials and soldiers who have sworn to uphold the constitutional government, and they allow their head of state to be put to death before their eyes. In fact, they don't just allow it, do they? They participate in his death. The very people you'd expect to uphold Jesus' lawful claim to the throne are the ones who laugh at it and try to defeat it. But of course, Jesus is a king that far exceeds just being a descendant of David. He is the king. He is the ruler of Israel, not just because he's descended from David. He is that because he is actually God on earth. He is entitled to rule not only the Jewish people, but all people. Pilate speaks truer than he knows when he says Jesus is a king, because he is Pilate's king too, which adds a different dimension to what is happening, what is being recorded in this event. See, chapter 15 of Mark's account is not just the tragic death of an innocent man. It's not just an account of the escape of the guilty. It also has the aspect of rebellion built into it, a rebellion of all humanity against its creator. The scribes and the priests and the crowds have done their level best to kill Jesus, and in doing that, they have not just been unjust, they are rebels. Jesus was entitled to their obedience, not their malice. And Pilate too. Jesus was entitled to be Pilate's king. What business did Pilate have to buy off the crowd rather than obeying his rightful king, his creator? He had no business at all. He had no right at all to do that. Once we've taken that into account, once we have taken this fact that Jesus is the rightful king, we realise that Barabbas is actually not the only rebel in this story. All of the others are in it up to their necks in this rebellion, rebels who kill their rightful king rather than obey him, rather than praise him, rather than worship him. And in some ways, Barabbas's rebellion is the least serious rebellion in this chapter. I mean, Barabbas has rebelled against Rome. Everyone else is rebelling against God. They have chosen to reject Jesus' claim to be their rightful king. It is actually the logical destination that started in Genesis chapter 3, that grasping at equality with God, no matter what the cost. And here we see the priests and the scribes and the crowd and Pilate and the Roman soldiers in an ever-widening circle of human responsibility for the death of the Son of God. And as we think about that ever-widening circle of responsibility, it becomes difficult to leave ourselves out, to let ourselves off. I have felt tempted to follow pragmatism rather than principle, just like Pilate. And of course you have too, haven't you? There are times when we would put Jesus on the cross ourselves. Chapter 15 of Mark is a very revealing chapter, an indication that, given half the chance, that humanity will do away with its creator. What is even more surprising is that God allows it to happen, because it's worth having another good hard look at Barabbas. Barabbas didn't die. He wasn't punished. He was replaced by Jesus. The reason? Well, because the crowd asked for him to be released and not Jesus. Jesus took Barabbas's place. The third cross on Calvary had been prepared for Barabbas, but it was but it was occupied instead by the innocent rightful king rather than the guilty rebel. I wonder how Barabbas reacted when he heard the news that Jesus was going to be killed instead of him. I suppose it would have been profound relief. I guess not even a terrorist wants to die by crucifixion. I guess he wouldn't have insisted on staying and being crucified as well. I don't blame him for getting the chance and taking it, getting away free. If I'd been him, I would have been out of the Antonia fortress and into the back streets of Jerusalem like I don't know what. I mean, he'd have been out of the gates, lost in the crowds on the way with all of those people there for the feast of the Passover. He might have looked back over his shoulder with a sigh of relief, and perhaps he might have even seen Golgotha with those 3 crosses on the skyline, 2 of them with guilty rebels on them. Perhaps people he knew, perhaps people he had led, but the 3rd one, in the middle, occupied by an innocent, rightful king. That would have been me. That would have been my thought if I was Barabbas. And wouldn't you wonder why Jesus allowed it to happen? Because, of course, that is exactly what Jesus does, doesn't he? That's the way the trial in Mark's Gospel is recorded for us. Jesus doesn't defend himself. Jesus allows himself to be arrested. He doesn't make the excuses when before Pilate that no doubt could and would have led to his release and freedom. And the reason that Jesus goes through this awful experience is this idea of replacement. Because on the cross he replaces not just the rebel Barabbas, but on the cross he replaces all who are guilty of rebellion against God and who accept the opportunity of freedom from the punishment that they deserve. Jesus, the only one never guilty of rebellion, is crucified as a rebel, as one of them, as one of us. Yet he chooses to bear our punishment, our blame, God's anger, as our replacement, if we accept it. He stands in our place, if we want, the innocent in the place of the guilty. And of course, once the price is paid, the debt is completely discharged. Once punishment is carried out, there is nothing more that needs to be done. If I accept Jesus as my substitute, then the crime of rebellion by me against God is over. I am at peace, no longer at war, and I enjoy the life he gives in all its fullness, in true freedom. Now, for us on this call, I suspect that none of that is new, is it? And I am not asking whether this is new for you today. What I'm asking today is, has this become normal for us? Has this become something we assume rather than something we believe? I'm really asking if we have lost something of both the wonder and the horror of the cross. If I've lost the wonder of the cross, then I shouldn't be surprised if I'm no longer really grateful to God. I shouldn't be surprised if I've lost the wonder of the cross, if I start to have a distorted view of God, seeing him as a joy-killing God rather than a life-giving God. I start to see him as being a lucky God to have someone like me to serve him. If I've lost the wonder of the cross, I will not only start to have a distorted view of God, I'll start to have a distorted view of me. My deeds, my actions, they won't any longer be a grateful response of an adopted son. They'll begin to become the actions of a self-righteous person before a good employer, notching up the brownie points so that I can acquire my trip to heaven. That's the danger of losing the wonder of the cross. And if I've lost the horror of what happened on the cross, the horror of the crucifixion, of the innocent king being in place of a guilty rebel, then I will not be humble anymore. I will become liable to having puffed up thoughts about myself. I will start to see myself as being better than Barabbas, and better than the priests, and better than Pilate, and better than Peter, and better than the disciples who ran away. Oh yes, it is right that I do feel outrage at the kind of crimes that a person like Barabbas will commit. My problem is how conditional I am when I'm outraged. How ready I am to be less outraged at my own sin than I am at their sin. How less outraged I am at my own falling short of the glory of God. So, here are some questions that I want to leave you with today. Is the cross still wonderful to you? Is the cross still horrible to you? Or is it just part of the furniture? Like a sofa that has been around for a couple of years too long, but you don't even really notice? Has it become ordinary? Is it normal? Thank you for listening to the recording of the Dublin Bible Talks. You can join us in real time on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom, bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks.